everybody, and welcome to the Meeting House, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dr. Dwight A. Moody, coming to you from our studios near Greenville, South Carolina. Joining me today in the Meeting House, my new friend, Dr. U.A. Thompson. He's a prominent community leader here in Greenville County. I'm pleased to call him a friend, a colleague, and a neighbor. Welcome, Dr. Thompson.
Thank you for having me. It is a pleasure to be here.
You've been all over the county today trying to solve problems and tap down controversy, I understand.
Yes, sir. It's been a busy day, but I'm up for the fight.
You're a voice for those who need it, aren't you?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Try to be there for them.
We're glad that you're in the Meeting House today.
Absolutely.
I look forward to our conversation.
Absolutely.
Also with me today, my piano pal, Michael Sebastian. We've been off for 4 weeks, Michael.
Indeed, I haven't seen you since last year.
Since last year. Well, Happy New Year to you then.
Same to you.
Yes, Michael's going to play for us a little Charles Wesley, a little John Prine, and what else?
Surprise?
Surprise me, Michael. Joining me today via Zoom is another friend, Brian McLaren, from his home in Florida. I was just with him at his annual conference on St. Simon's Island. It's called Southern Lights. I wrote about it this week in my weekly newsletter. You can read that article and subscribe to the newsletter at TheMeetingHouse.net. I also include in that newsletter a review of the book with the title, it's a long title, Homebrewed Christianity's Guide to the Holy Spirit, Hand Raisers, Han, and the Holy Ghost, written by the Reverend Dr. Grace Jill Sun Kim. It's a wonderful little book. I enjoyed it so much. I enjoyed hearing her speak. I'm going to talk a little bit later with Brian McLaren about his book, which came out last year, 2022, Do I Stay Christian? A Guide for Doubters, the Disappointed, and the Disillusioned, which covers most of us at some time.
Yes.
My review of this book is also on the website, but stay tuned for our discussion. It's quite a show today. I'm glad to be back in the studio. I'm glad you've joined us today. Glad to be surrounded by my broadcast team, those behind the cameras, as well as those with me here in the studio. But let's begin with the news. Dr. Thompson, from St. Paul, Minnesota. A controversy at the United Methodist Connected Hamline University in St. Paul continues to simmer. As we've reported earlier here in the Meeting House, the contract of an adjunct art history professor was not renewed after students complained she had used in a class presentation a piece of Islamic art depicting the Islamic prophet Muhammad. The latest wrinkle is a statement issued by the National Council on American Islamic Relations saying the instructor did not act with bigoted intent when she showed the 14th century painting of Muhammad. The statement issued as, quote, the official position of the national organization counteracts remarks made by its Minnesota chapter's executive director, who said the classroom viewing of the painting was Islamophobic. My dear friend, we're just learning how to accommodate Islam in our country, aren't we?
Right. Yes, absolutely. But you know, I think we have to understand what the classroom is for. The classroom is for liberating minds. And I think this country has lost sight of that. And we are consistently putting handcuffs on professors and on teachers in the classrooms, especially those at academic level. They should be free to express themselves in a manner that is for educational purposes.
You know, we've been following this story for some time, and I'm trying to think if there are elements of our own Christian tradition which would offend people if we were to bring them into the classroom, or as we do bring them into the classroom. I remember when I was teaching at the college level, there were 18-year-old kids coming in every year who'd been in Sunday school all their life, had never been in a college class where we talked about ideas and read books that were shocking to them. I remember.
Absolutely.
I even remember when I was that age.
Absolutely.
How shocked and horrified I was when I had to deal with the real stuff of Holy Scripture. What would happen if we were to clamp down on professors and say, no, you can't say that because it offends somebody?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, there's some things that I've said in the classroom teaching at college level that have been offensive to some right from the Holy Bible.
There's a lot in the Bible that's pretty offensive.
That's pretty offensive, you know, and people can take offense to a number of things found right in the sacred scriptures. So I think we have to be very understanding and flexible when it comes to the classroom, especially considering that is the place where ideas are meant to be broadened, exercised, and minds are meant to be expanded.
I'm hoping to do a whole show on this subject, especially dealing with the Islamic art and Islamic ideas. I'm trying to get that squared up for the next week or two. Let's go now to Washington, D.C., another very controversial story. The United States Supreme Court agreed to hear an appeal by a former mail carrier in Pennsylvania who accused the U.S. Postal Service of religious bias after being reprimanded for refusing to deliver packages on Sundays. They were Amazon packages. It wasn't the regular mail. The justices took up Gerald Groff's case after lower courts dismissed his case. Groff, an evangelical Christian, refused to work on Sunday and claimed that the Postal Service violated federal anti-discrimination law by refusing to exempt him from working on Sundays. Lower courts found that his demands placed too much hardship on his co-workers and employer. As a matter of fact, the fact is he worked in a small rural post office. There were only 4 carriers. When he backed out of Sunday carrying, it put an extra load on the other 3 carriers. That was part of the issue here.
Right.
What do you think about that? How far should companies go to accommodate the religious preferences of people?
Well, I think we're walking a very fine line here, and I think the justices need to be very careful as to their decisioning on this issue, because we can get into some hot water as far as the exercising of people's rights as it relates to their religious calls to duty when it comes to this issue. You know, people can start saying all kinds of stuff as a religious duty, or, you know, I don't want to do this because it's a religious response or what have you, you know, and this can get very chalky.
You know, I can conceive of a religious mail carrier saying, I'm not going to deliver what I consider pornography in the mail to somebody. That's a violation of my religion. But on the question of Sunday, I remember I lived in Jerusalem for a long time, and you always knew the religion of the shopkeepers because the Muslims were closed on Friday, and the Jews were closed on Saturday. The Christians the shops were closed on Sunday. It was a good way to tell when people what their religion was. Now let's go to Indianapolis. 3 dozen historic black religious sites will receive a multi-million-dollar infusion of funding to help them with renovations and preservation of their buildings. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has a unit called the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, and they announced Monday that 35 churches are the recipients of the first round of its Preserving Black Churches grants. The Lilly Endowment of Indianapolis is funding the $20 million multi-year initiative. Among the churches receiving grants this year is the Reedy Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church of Galveston, Texas. Have you ever been to Galveston?
Yes. Beautiful.
But have you ever been to this little church?
Never been to this particular church, but I've been to Galveston.
Well, this church is on Broadway
Okay.
at the north end of the island, but it is the site of the first gathering of what we now call Juneteenth,
Yes.
June 19th,
Yes.
1865.
Right.
I happen to know this detail because I happened to be in Galveston one year for the celebration.
Beautiful.
I went in the sanctuary, it was packed. There were speakers and music and drummers, and right behind me on the back row of the church
Yes.
was the, what would you call it? The men were dressed up in Union uniforms
Okay.
of the Civil War, because as soon as the service was over at this Reedy Chapel, we all went out in the street and had a march following
Wow.
them down to the courthouse, where
Beautiful. Beautiful.
they read the famous, I think it's called General Order Number 3,
Wow.
telling the people that all the slaves were free.
Wow. But just think how much this means to the African American community, and considering the history of the country relative to slavery, how much blood, sweat, and tears have gone into the ground for this money to be seeded into these churches. This is a blessing in disguise, and we have to pause and pay homage to the Lilly Foundation for doing this. This is an honor indeed, and it's a true blessing that these churches are finally getting the upfit that they readily deserve and need for such a time as this.
You know, sometime we're going to do a whole show
Yes.
on the impact of African American religion
Oh,
on the Christian church. There are some
Yes.
people recently who have said,
absolutely.
with all the dysfunction and trouble in the white Christian church
Absolutely.
community, that we're looking to the black church
Absolutely.
to lead the way forward. We need to do
Absolutely.
a whole show on
It's
that,
the
don't
great
we?
hope.
One more story today, this one from Dallas and Atlanta, really from all over. Inspired by the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday just this past weekend, large and influential Baptist churches in 2 southern cities hosted prominent political candidates in their pulpits. Our president, Joe Biden, spoke at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, and our former Vice President, Mike Pence, spoke at the First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. And elsewhere, thousands of congregations and communities celebrated the holiday with marches, speeches, and community service projects. Where were you on Martin Luther King Day?
Well, I was around town here in Greenville, remembering how hard it took us to get a King holiday passed right here in Greenville County.
Really?
We were the last county in the entire country to have an official holiday to celebrate Dr. King's birthday.
What a shameful.
The last
honor
county in
the
the
country.
entire country. It took us marching. It took the Reverend Jesse Jackson, myself, and many others doing protests at county council. One night we even did a sit-in and staged a shut-in all night long. We got churches to bus people in. We marched down the middle of Church Street. We did all kinds of things to get this county council of that day to pass the King holiday, and finally we got the holiday passed after many protests, and I just sat there and reflected on how hard we had to fight just to get Greenville County to pass a King holiday. And we ultimately had to unseat about 4 council people to make that happen.
Really? Boy, we need to unpack this story as well.
So I was remembering that, and it was a true blessing to see so many people honoring Dr. King in such a special way, in their own way, in different areas.
You're in the meeting house where we have conversation on religion and American life. As we've had here, I'm here with my friend, Dr. U.A. Thompson.
Yes, sir.
Also my neighbor, my colleague in the ministry, and colleague in community leadership,
Yes.
Activism,
Absolutely.
and standing for what is just and what is right. We're glad you're here today. We'll be back in just a minute with my interview with Brian McLaren, but let's take a break and listen to some great Martin Luther King Jr. music. You are in the meeting house where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dr. Dwight A. Moody. Glad to introduce to you today somebody who's been in the meeting house before, Brian McLaren from his home in Florida. Brian is a noted pastor, author, public theologian, and now the host of an annual conference on my home territory, St. Simon's Island. Brian, welcome back to the meeting house.
Great to be back with you, Dwight.
I was thrilled to be with you at your conference just this past weekend and to see you and hear you speak. I'll have more to say about that in just a few minutes, but I want to talk about your book. Came out last year, Do I Stay Christian? A Guide for the Doubters, the Disappointed, and the Disillusioned. Well, that's many of us, you know. If you were to take all three of those categories, that would include a lot of us, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think it would, especially these days.
Especially these days. These are transformational days for religion in America, especially for the Christian religion. And you've been writing about this for at least 15, if not 20 years. Am I not right about that?
Yep, that's about right, yes.
I have. You started writing when you were a pastor
Yes.
up in Maryland, if I remember right.
That's exactly right.
Exactly right, and a series of books. And now you've written this one, Do I Stay Christian? It is a question that you raise, and then you give 10 reasons why people are saying no, and then 10
Yes.
reasons why people are saying yes, and then you give some concluding thoughts. I've read the book. I have reviewed the book. You make a statement on page 167. I'd like to give you permission to make a shift in your own thinking.
Mm.
You've had quite a few shifts in your own thinking over the years, haven't you?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. I grew up in, really some of the most theologically conservative and socially conservative sectors of the Christian faith anywhere in the world, really. So, my life has been both cherishing the benefits and blessings that came to me through my heritage, and also struggling with some of them and trying to figure out how I would hold on to the treasures, let some other things go, and find a way forward.
I guess that's one of the reasons why I've resonated with your book so much, because that's exactly my pilgrimage and the pilgrimage of most of the people that I know. You know, back when I was teaching at the college and students would come into the classroom fresh out of, 18 years of Sunday school and encountering the Bible in a fresh way, I always received them knowing that that's where I was when I was 18.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's been a long journey for me. It's been a long journey for a lot of people. You as well. You write in this book. You talk about the transformation of religion in America, the transformation of the Christian religion, not just your own personal faith, but tell us what you mean by this.
Well, I'm 66. I jokingly say that I know I don't look a day over 76 or 86, but I'm 66. And in the years of my life, there's been just so many waves of change. I was on my way out of Christian faith. I happened to be born into what people today would call fundamentalism, and a very sectarian form of fundamentalism. Of course, when you grow up fundamentalist, just as if you grow up Roman Catholic or Southern Baptist or Eastern Orthodox or Buddhist or Jewish, whatever you grow up with is normal. It's what you accept as the way things are. But it just seems that every sector of the Christian faith, like other faiths, has had to cope with so much external change, and then that's resulted in internal change. And one of the interesting challenges is that a lot of religious communities don't want to change. They see change as a temptation to become less faithful to God and less faithful to the scriptures and so on. But here's the interesting thing. When you resist change, you change because you become more resistant. When you're afraid of change, you change because you become more afraid. And so then when you realize what a complicated thing it is to live in a changing world, in a religion that is uncomfortable with change, you just realize, it's going to be tumultuous, and there's going to be conflict and controversy. But, and then in a sense, I think we have to grow up and say, okay, well, everybody's not going to make the choices I'm going to make, but what path am I going to take? What do I feel is the responsible and right and loving and wise path to take? So I think, even people who come to opposite conclusions on matters of religious controversy, the thing they share in common is they're trying to be faithful and trying to find a wise and healthy way forward.
The irony of it is that our faith is rooted in a couple of very prominent change agents called Jesus and Paul.
Yes, that's right.
And in fact, as many of the heroes, who we call the heroes of our faith over the years, were themselves change agents, leading dramatic movements of change in the Christian faith and in the broader culture. So describe to us the kind of Christian faith you want to see develop in the 21st century.
Yes. Well, I could begin, Dwight, by saying that the version of Christianity I grew up with was primarily focused on what happens after you die. And everything you do between now and the time of your death is in some ways trying to be sure that you have the right outcome after death. And through a whole series of experiences, including just being a preacher and preaching through books of the Bible and really engaging with the whole Bible, not just jumping around to pick the parts that I liked or that I agreed with. As I preached through the Bible, I realized that, for example, in the Lord's Prayer, we do not learn how to pray, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. May we go to your kingdom up in heaven after we die." Instead, we pray, "May your will be done down here on earth, right now, as it is in heaven." And so the biggest shift that's happened in my faith is realizing that Jesus' original message was not an evacuation plan, but a transformation plan. And so what that forced me to do is to say, well, if this life matters, if this world matters, what's going on in this world, and what does the wisdom of the scriptures, and especially the wisdom of the life and teaching of Jesus, have to teach me about that? And we could talk about this for hours, but I came up with 4 fundamental problems that I think we face. First is the crisis of the planet. How do we live with the earth in a wise and respectful way? Second is the crisis of poverty. How do those of us with privilege and power and money use what we've been given to benefit everybody, not just to hoard for ourselves? Then is the crisis of peace, that when you have some people holding on and other people in desperate need, you often have violence, and in between individuals and then between nations. How do we work for peace? So the planet, poverty, peace, and then fourth is politics and religion. The 2 spheres of life that we would hope would help us deal with the planet, poverty, and peace, politics and religion, are often part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So how can we bring needed renewal? And those would be the 4 Ps that I would hope people would pay attention to going forward. The planet, poverty, peace, and then how can we have a more healthy politics and a more healthy and loving way of conducting our spiritual lives?
That's a very clever and accessible way for you to list and name your issues. I'm just a few years older than you are, Brian, but I remember when I was a young person, a teenager, a college student, the big energy among young adults who wanted to really be serious about Christ was in what we then called world evangelization.
Yes.
And the big organizations like Campus Crusade and InterVarsity, they were very focused on this, the 4 spiritual laws. Yet if you were to die today, do you know you would go to heaven and all that? But now, in more recent years, in my own college teaching and working with young people, the energy is all flowing in another direction. It is towards social justice. It is toward what you're describing right here, caring for the planet. I was glad you mentioned the Lord's Prayer. I'm preaching through the Lord's Prayer right now, which I consider, think about this, the most widely known and oft-repeated collection of words in the history of human language. We can talk about that.
That's right. And it's so revolutionary.
It is so revolutionary.
Exactly right.
So here is my question. Can our religion, the faith and practice of our religion, which is at the core of our culture, can it move through a transformation without transformation in the other segments of our culture, like education and economics and politics? Are they all linked together?
Yeah. Oh, what a rich question. So let me first say that I think what we first have to say about the Christian religion is it's not one thing, it's many things. And you might say there isn't Christianity in America, there are Christianities in America, and the different Christianities are working for opposite things, and they have been since the beginning of American history. Just to maybe take 2 or 3 stop-off points in American history, there were Christians in the 13 colonies who believed that God had given them as European Christians the right to steal the lands and even exterminate the native peoples of this land. And there were other Christians who said, no, these are human beings made in the image of God, and we have to treat them with respect and see them as our neighbors, our sisters, our brothers. When we come to the era of slavery, the vast majority of Christians were supporting slavery and all of the horror that it entailed. But there was a minority of Christians who led the fight of abolition. So you just look at those two critical moments in American history, Christians were doing the opposite. Mm-hmm. And the same is true today. So I think what we have to say is Christianities in their various forms inevitably will transform America. The question is, will it be for the worse or for the better? And I think that's where each of us, in a sense, votes with our lives. How we live and what form of Christian faith we're going to live out will affect economics and politics and race relations and the environment, education, every dimension of life. And, you know, maybe we can see it a little more clearly sometimes for ourselves if we look at other nations with different religious heritages. So you think, for example, in Israel, Jewish people, some Jewish people are for dispossessing the Palestinians of their lands. Mm-hmm. Other Jewish people are protecting the human rights of Palestinians. In India, there's a Hindu majority and a Muslim minority. In Myanmar or Burma, there's a Buddhist majority and a Muslim minority. In each different case, different members of the same religion are doing opposite things. And so we have to, I think in a certain sense, this wakes us up. In fact, it's part of what's behind Do I Stay Christian, is to realize that just because you have the Christian label doesn't mean much until you say, how am I going to live as a Christian? What kind of Christian am I going to be if I'm going to be one?
Brian, do you feel like a minority voice in the Christian community in the United States?
Well, I mean, statistically, I suppose I am. I certainly feel it where I live here in Florida. You know, I live in an area where that's a real stronghold of the Proud Boys, who joined with a couple of other groups on January 6, 2001 to try to overthrow the government. And they're very active, and I've had some very intense confrontations with them. And on the one hand, you know, I've felt a good bit of threat and intimidation from them. On the other hand, I realize they're just human beings. And so I simultaneously feel a minority, but also realize that at the end of the day, we're all human beings, and we try to find a way to live as neighbors, even though there are other forces that are trying to divide us and turn us into enemies. Yeah.
You, last year, 2022, you launched into a new part of your ministry by taking the leadership of a conference that's been going on for a while. I want to come back after a short break and talk about this, about the conference Southern Lights, and which we just finished last weekend. I want to talk about your vision for it and who you're connected with and what you see as the potential for it. I'm Dwight Moody in the Meeting House, talking with my guest, Brian McLaren. We'll be back in just a minute. We're going to take a break. I'm going to show you a video that I personally made last weekend on St. Simon's Island, where my home is, at Epworth by the Sea, which is a Methodist retreat, conference, and now a recreation center. We had a big gathering with Brian and others there. We're going to show you a video. And while we're playing the video, Michael, my companion here in the Meeting House, is going to play one of the great Charles Wesley hymns. Charles Wesley, who began his ministry, I believe it was 1742, on St. Simon's Island at Christ Episcopal Church. He's going to play one of these great hymns. Let's take a look and a listen. We'll be back in just a minute. That is a video that I took last weekend on St. Simon's Island, Georgia, where my home is. That was the grounds of Epworth by the Sea, which is a Methodist conference center, a retreat center, a recreation center. And I was glad to take that video when I was attending a conference called Southern Lights. And we have with us today in the meeting house my longtime friend and guest, public theologian, pastor, author, talking to us from his home in Florida today, Brian McLaren. Thanks for being with us in the meeting house. This is not your first visit with us. I hope it will not be the last. But we were together last weekend on St. Simon Island, a beautiful place. It didn't feel like St. Simon's Island because it was so cold. We had people there from Canada and other northern places that were very discouraged or disappointed that it wasn't warmer. I think it got a lot warmer as we were leaving. I know that to be the case, as a matter of fact.
That's right.
Michael played the great Charles Wesley hymn, Love Divine, All Love's Excelling, one of my very, very favorite hymns to sing.
Yes.
Tell us about the conference and your first experience of the conference.
Sure. Well, a bit of history. Something like 19 years ago, 20 years ago or so, a fellow who lives in your area, Buzzy Pickren, hosted a conference, and it was called January Adventure.
Right.
And there was such a warm response that they kept it going year after year after year. And then Buzzy got older, and it was passed on to another wonderful person, Peter McCall, and he led for a couple of years. And then during COVID, it wasn't possible to meet, and so I had spoken, I think, 3 times at January Adventure, and one day, and so had my friend Diana Butler Bass, another author and speaker who lives up in Virginia. And Diana heard that it was going to be canceled, so she called me and said, "Don't you think January Adventure is too good a thing to let stop?" And of course, Diana felt this, and I felt this. She being in Virginia, me being in Florida. It just feels like there is so much going on in the southeastern United States today, and so we said, this really should keep going. So we contacted the folks who were leading it and said, look, if we were to keep this going, would you share the email addresses and so on? So that's how it happened. Their generosity made it possible for us to try to say, let's keep this going and see if we can give it a second life. And so we changed the name to Southern Lights. And our hope is to help people see, kind of like we were talking about earlier, that they may have a very constricted understanding of what it means to be a Christian, but we'd like to help people have a wider and brighter understanding of what it could mean to be a Christian. So we have each of our gatherings, we've tried to bring together racial diversity to get folks who are of European descent and African American, Asian American, other speakers and leaders and teachers together, because we think in the South, as everywhere, it's important to have a diversity of voices, women, men. This time we were so happy we had Protestant, Catholic, so to get a variety of bright, thoughtful voices to help people expand their horizons.
The picture that showed up on my Facebook page today was 3 years ago when you and Will Gaffney were the keynote speakers. I interviewed both of you for the Meeting House. We were then just on the radio. And I believe that was your first appearance, or it wasn't an appearance, a first voice in the Meeting House. But I was reminded of that. That was, I guess, 2020. And then they were off a year because of COVID. You came back in 22 during the Memorial Day holiday last year, and I was there, and was glad to be back again in January. When, like I said earlier, it was supposed to be warm, but it wasn't. It was it was cold. You said something last year in the 2022 conference that I've thought a lot about. You said this may be the largest gathering of progressive Christians that you know about. I've thought a lot about that. And aside from some denominational gatherings, and perhaps some black ministers' gatherings like the Hampton,
Yes. Yes.
the National Progressive Baptist would attract large crowds. But this may be, you're right, it may be one of the largest gatherings that's intentionally progressive, especially for the white audience, white Protestant audience. I was there this past week when you went through the litany of all the denominations and had people raise their hand. I was surprised at how few Baptists there were down there in the middle of Georgia. And I resolved then and there to try to change that number in years to come.
That's great.
Your message, so how would you define what it means to be a progressive Christian? Mm-hmm. You use that phrase in your subtitle. How do you define that?
Yeah. Well, we were talking about change earlier, and one way to say it is that some folks think that the best days were in the past, and that our job is people keep getting away from the high point in the past and they're sliding down a slippery slope. And their desire, because that's the way they see things, is to conserve everything they can from the past. And other people say, well, for some people, the best days were in the past, but for other people, the past wasn't so great. And so they say, we're reaching forward to better days in the future. And so their attitude tends to be, we need to keep making progress. And there's truth on both sides. There are great things from the past we don't want to lose. But I think people whose more of their energy goes into how can we bring a better future, I think those are the people who would identify as progressive. I should say, I have some critiques of the word progressive too, mm-hmm. because sometimes when people are progressive, they believe that progress is inevitable. And I think that's a dangerous thought. I think we can go backwards as we move forwards. In other words, for example, we just celebrated Martin Luther King mm-hmm. Jr. Day. And when I think we have made a little bit of racial progress. Well, we've made a lot since 1850. But, in my lifetime, we've made a little bit of progress. But you know what? We could lose that progress and we could go backwards. So I don't think progress is inevitable. But I think wherever we can try to move toward better days in the future, that progressive spirit is something that I hold dear.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, Brian. A good bit of your energy in the progressive stream has been in the realm of ideas and what people think and how we articulate what we believe. This, of course, is a very critical part of who we are and how we see ourselves and what we are becoming. But it's only one little sliver in that sense of the whole cultural thing, institutional and personality and power and structures and politics. Yes. How does what you are doing flow out of just the idea stage into the action stage, into the structure stage?
Yes, so this is a complicated thing because I don't think it's linear. I used to think that ideas lead to actions, mm-hmm. actions lead to, ideas lead to individual action leads to group action leads to cultural and civilizational change. I don't think it's that simple. I think it's more like a messy tangle. I think sometimes changes, external changes, political changes. For example, when we think about race, my father's father, who I love, respected so much, but he also had things that I didn't respect, and he was a white supremacist. He was the kind of guy born in the late 1800s. He would born in Scotland, and he had what people would call jingoism. He believed that the British were the British Empire was the best, and he was a white supremacist, and he would quote Bible verses about the curse of Ham and all kinds of things that I hope people today have never heard of, but it was somewhat common back in those days. And my dad was so different. When I was a boy, the church we attended in Maryland was a segregated church. It was all white, and if a person of color came, some very polite white men in suits would tell them about the church of our denomination that was for black folk. And my parents thought that was terrible. And in fact, my parents always would invite people of color to our table, and they would bring people of color to the church just to stretch the the assumptions of the group there. And I asked my dad once, I said, "How did you change? You were so different than your father in this way." And my dad, I wondered if he'd say it was a Bible verse or a sermon, or he said it was the Army. When the Army integrated, it was the first time he was thrown into sleeping next to somebody in the next bunk or working with somebody or whatever who was of another race. And he said it showed me that everything I'd heard about race was a lie and was wrong. My experience told me this because of a social change. So I think that we work for change at all levels simultaneously. Obviously, I do a lot of writing because I don't think I ever change people's mind about anything. I think people change their own minds but something you said earlier, I think maybe what I can do in writing is when people are ready to change their mind, I can help them feel permission to let that happen. And hopefully that is connected to a change in behavior.
Well, I quoted that comment of yours, I'm giving you permission to change your mind. Really, it's
Yes.
It's a phrase that parents, teachers, even preachers from the pulpit need to articulate over and over and over again. I'm giving you permission to change your mind, to change your behavior, to change your convictions about things as part of what it means to be human. This past weekend at the conference, of course, we heard Reggie Williams from McCormick Seminary in Chicago speak and then preach. And when he was speaking, I think, on Saturday morning, he mentioned Ebo Landing. And I spoke to him afterwards. I said, Reggie, have you ever been to Ebo Landing? And of course, he had not been anywhere on the island. And I got the privilege of filling the car with friends and taking them on a tour of the whole island. Ebo Landing is really just a couple of blocks from my house. Have you been to Ebo Landing, Brian?
I was so jealous that I couldn't stay and be part of that little field trip because I have heard about it, but I've never been. So I hope next year I'll get to go.
Let's put it on your agenda.
Yes.
And then Grace Ji-Sun Kim spoke. What a wonderful, delightful person. I did not know who she was. Reggie and I were already Facebook friends, but Grace I did not know. I bought her book on the Holy Spirit. I read her book on the Holy Spirit. I reviewed it for TheMeetingHouse.net. And this book, which she wrote, is so full of her lively, warm, humorous, delightful, joyful spirit. I could just see her dancing and laughing on every single page of this book. It stretched my mind as she talked about Asian idea, the Asian idea of Han. I guess that's the way you pronounce it, H-A-N?
Yes, yes.
Han, of the burden that we carry of injustice, of having suffered injustice. And then, of course, she talks about this Korean idea, and I don't know how to pronounce this, It's either chi, like the Greek letter, or it's chi. Do you know how to?
Chi.
It's
Yeah,
chi.
Chi. Yeah.
This Korean idea of the human spirit, which chi, of course, connects with our idea of the Holy Spirit. And I thought, just of reading the book, after I got home from the conference, how my mind was stretched in ways that I had been looking for it. I'd been looking for ideas and concepts to stretch my own mind. It's part of the impact of what you're doing, Brian.
Well, that's encouraging. You know, I bet you have had moments like this too, Dwight. I remember being literally in like 7th grade and sitting in a church service, and I thought I could tell you the next thing the preacher was going to say.
I have been that preacher. And so have you early in your ministry. But you were very predictable as a preacher. I know when we started.
That's right. So, but I remember thinking, oh, so this is how it works. Until you're about 12 years old, you hear new things. And then for the rest of your life, you just judge how good a preacher did in telling you what you already knew.
That's exactly right.
And I think so many of us, we don't realize there is so much more to learn and so much more to explore. That education, what's the old saying, youth is wasted on the young? Well, the fact is, education, if we think that education is just for young people, we're missing something. All through our lives, there's so much more to learn. And so that's one of the ideas behind Southern Lights, that we want to be sure every year we bring people who will stretch you and not require you to agree with them even, but offer what they have to offer to see how we can be stretched.
I'm going to give you another testimony of something that happened to me last weekend. After this Saturday morning session, I turned to my friend Mike Kerrigan, who is a longtime friend, was attending with me, and I said, Mike, I feel like I've been drinking out of a fire hydrant. I cannot process any more today. I've got so many ideas and thoughts and emotions running through me and around me and over me. Yes. I can't process. So actually, Brian, I have to confess, I went out to the lobby, turned on the television, and watched the Kentucky-Georgia basketball game.
Yes.
And to me, that was, an inspirational moment too, because Kentucky won. Brian, I want to thank you for all that you're doing. I thank you for your writing. I thank you for your influence on me. I thank you for taking over and leading now and inspiring for this conference, Southern Lights. I look forward to being there next year. And God bless you and all that you do. Thank you for being in the meeting house with us today. Let's do it again sometime real soon.
Thank you so much. Thanks for all the good you and the meeting house are doing.
I'll be back in just a minute in the meeting house. You're listening to the music of John Prine, his famous song, Paradise. When I die, let my ashes float down the green river. Let my soul roll on up to the Rochester Dam. I'll be halfway to heaven with paradise waiting, just 5 miles away from wherever I am. I'm playing that today not only because I love John Prine, as you know, I'm going to have his picture here behind me on the wall, but because over the Christmas holidays, I went to Kentucky. This song, Muhlenberg County, is about a small village or a small town named Paradise that used to be in Kentucky, where John Prine's folks were. I went to Kentucky over the holidays because it's my home, but as I went, I received an invitation from an acquaintance of mine to appear on a radio show as a guest talking about transgender issues. I wrote her back and said, what do I know about transgender issues? I had been introduced to this person, or she had written me, because a person had written about John Prine, and somebody had connected her to me because of this. I know this is convoluted, but I went to Kentucky for the holidays and was a guest on this program, a radio program about transgender issues. The whole thing was an education for me. I wrote an article about it the next day, the next week, and said something that I was not supposed to say. The person who was interviewing me, her name was Jana, but her previous name, what they call the dead name, I knew. I used it in my article. A big no-no. I was quickly and emphatically corrected. It was a learning issue for me about the transgender community. I'm going to do a whole show on that also. And she may very well be my guest, and we will talk about this episode. But we've had a great show today in the Meeting House. Thank you, my friend and neighbor and colleague.
Thank you for having me.
U.A. Thompson.
It's been a
We
pleasure.
live within walking distance of one another in Travelers Rest, South Carolina.
Yes.
I look forward to you being back on the show.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Michael, for being at the keyboard. Thank you to Brian McLaren for being my guest today, talking about his book, Do I Stay Christian? You can read all about all of this at TheMeetingHouse.net. You can subscribe to my newsletter, and you can register and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for being here today. I'm Dwight Moody in the Meeting House. Join us again next week for another conversation on religion and American life. Have a good day.